I trust you'll enjoy our time in our Old Testament overview as we study the 39 books of the Old Testament. I consider this a great blessing to be able to do this with you, and we've provided some resources at pastorshawn.com/old, pastorshawn.com//old. You'll find a basic breakdown, an overview of every one of these 39 books there in that website. You also find videos and other resources that I'll be putting there to help you understand the beauty and significance of the Old Testament and the incredible picture it paints of a God who is working his eternal plan of redemption and the promise of a Messiah. And so again, pastorshawn.com/old for any one of the sessions, this session or any one of the sessions, you can find resources there. May God bless you as you walk with me through the Old Testament. Well, welcome to session 5 of our Old Testament overview course. And we're jumping into 3 books today. And we kind of pick up where we left off historically. We looked at 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles last week. And now we pick up with Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther. And they basically continue the story for us, especially as we move into Ezra. It picks up where 2nd Chronicles left off. And so we're going to be looking at Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, these 3 wonderful Old Testament books. Let's jump into Ezra. And again, let me just remind you that you can go to pastorshawn.com/old to get a hold of the PDF handouts for this 5th session. And as we talk about Ezra, the title and meaning of this book is that it's named after the traditionally accepted author for the main character of the second half of the Septuagint. And Ezra and Nehemiah were treated as one unit in Hebrew and in the Greek Septuagint. The Greek Septuagint was the translation of the Hebrew Old Testament that was in Greek and used in Jesus' day. They were separated in the Latin Vulgate, so they became 2 different books. And they kind of really do cover 2 different stories, so it's a nice, easy break, and it's a great place for us to be able to study them. This is, again, Ezra is a part of the historical section of the Bible. So far, we've looked at the Pentateuch, and then we've looked at the historical books. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and now Ezra, and then Nehemiah, and even Esther. The author and date, Ezra is not specifically mentioned as the author, but probably is the author. Jewish tradition and the fact that portions of chapters 7 and 9 are written in the first person from Ezra's point of view would support his authorship. Probably written between 457 BC, the events of chapters 7 through 10, and 444 BC, Nehemiah's arrival in Jerusalem. So it's just before Nehemiah, and the style of this writing is narrative. So it's again not poetry, it's not prophecy, it's not like a teaching or a didactic. It's telling a story, it's narrative, and it may have some other genres of literature inside it, but it's primarily narrative. And then the theme and key verse. The theme, Ezra, is a continuation of the narrative of 2nd Chronicles, as we mentioned. It shows how God fulfills his promise to return his people to the land of promise after 70 years of exile. If you think of Jeremiah and all the various prophets who predicted and prophesied that the northern kingdom of Israel will be judged because of their waywardness by their enemies, and Assyria judged them. God used them to judge his people of the northern kingdom of Israel. And the southern kingdom of Judah, we said in 586, was conquered by Babylon. So you had 722 BC. The Assyrians take the northern kingdom of Israel. In 586, the southern kingdom of Judah is taken by the Babylonians, King Nebuchadnezzar. And the prophecy had been after Jerusalem fell, 70 years later, God would begin to restore and return the people. Not everyone returned. In the north, the Assyrians sort of just intermingled with the Israelites, and the Israelites that moved to different places intermingled with the Assyrians. In the south, many of them were taken off into captivity and lived separate from the Babylonians and later the Medes and Persians. And so they do actually return to the land. In the north, not many were taken captive. They were just killed and conquered. But now there is this return from the exile. that Ezra is helping us focus on, and it fulfills the 70-year prophecy and the promise that had come that it would take 70 years of exile. Israel's second exodus, this is often thought of because they leave the Babylonian Empire, actually the Medes and Persian Empire, because the Medes and Persians conquered the Babylonians, and King Artaxerxes allows them to return. It's a less impressive because it's only a remnant that leaves Babylon, not all the people of Israel, of Judah. Ezra relates the story of two returns from Babylon, first led by Zerubbabel to rebuild the temple. He comes to rebuild the temple, and the second under the leadership of Ezra to rebuild the spiritual condition of the people. Zerubbabel brings the people back to rebuild the temple, but then it's Ezra who opens the word of God, has the people stand and listen as it's read, and they recommit to the Lord. And then, as in Chronicles, there is a strong priestly emphasis. Ezra was a direct descendant of Aaron through Eleazar, Phinehas, and Zadok. These were all priests that were a part of the tribe of Levi. And Ezra fulfills that in his heritage, and then he serves as that priest as Zerubbabel leads them back. Just as the Israelites were taken into exile in three consecutive stages, 605, 597, and 586 BC, they returned in three stages. The first occurred under the leadership of Zerubbabel around 538 BC. After considerable delay, this return resulted in the rebuilding of the temple in 520 to 516 BC. Encouraged by the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, Ezra led the second return in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, the king or emperor of the Persians, in Artaxerxes I, around 458 BC. And then Nehemiah led the final return in the 20th year of Artaxerxes in 444 BC. Chronologically, the events of the book of Ezra occur during a 10 to 12 period of years, 10 to 12 years, from 583 to about 573 between the first and second returns. During the period covered by the book of Ezra, Gautama Buddha, who was very famous, of course, founder of Buddhism, 560 to 580 BC, was in India. Confucius, 551 to 479, was in China, and Socrates was in Greece. And so it just helps us understand kind of the time frame of the book of Ezra as he leads the people in return, and he has them recommit to the Lord since they had been so wayward, and God judged them through the Babylonians and even the Assyrians. The basic theme of Ezra is restoration, the restoration of the temple, and the spiritual, moral, and social restoration of the returned remnant in Jerusalem under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Ezra. This comes from Nelson's complete book of Bible maps and charts. I thought it was so succinct that I just wanted to emphasize that. The theme verse, and this is my favorite verse of Ezra, it's Ezra 7:10. For Ezra had devoted himself to the study and observance of the law of the Lord and to teaching its decrees and laws in Israel. That's kind of one of those that when you're in seminary, it becomes one of your favorite verses because he committed himself to teaching and preaching the word of God. And so that's why it's become such an important verse to me, because Ezra understood to return the people to their committed state as a nation, as individuals, as families. It was going to take the teaching of the Word of God and then begin to apply it to their lives. And they had been judged for a lack of teaching the Word of God and a lack of obedience to the Word of God. They'd strayed from the Lord to the idols of Baal and other false gods. So at a glance, Ezra, as far as a chart goes, you've got the 10 chapters of Ezra. The first 6 deal with the restoration of the temple under Zerubbabel. And then chapters 7 through 10 deal with the reformation of the people. This is where Ezra steps up as the priest, now serving in the restored temple. And you can see the visions: the first return to Jerusalem, the construction of the temple, the second return, and the restoration of the people. Chapters 1 through 6 really tells the story of Zerubbabel leading the people back. And then chapters 7 through 10 is Ezra's time of leading the people back. And you can see the numbers are given there. First return, this book lists 49,897 people return. And then in the second return under Ezra, 1,754 people return, as the book states in those chapters. Location is Persia to Jerusalem, and there's Persia to Jerusalem again in the second part of that. It's about a 22-year period there in the first 6 chapters, and then it's 1 year in chapters 7 through 10. There are no really major problems with the book itself. There's some slight questions about dates, and that's why we say it's about that time. Main characters are Zerubbabel and Ezra. The main events are the first return of Judah from Babylon under Zerubbabel, first 6 chapters, and then chapters 7 through 10, the second return of Judah from Babylon under Ezra. The theological significance is God is faithful in restoring his people. He keeps his promises. He said they'll be exiled for 70 years, and they were. The personal significance is God is always ready and willing to restore his child after a time of sin. And God is always willing when we've been kind of in the far country, even like the prodigal son, and we return to him. He embraces us and welcomes us home like the Father. And in a way, these 2 returns that we see of the 3 major returns to the land from the time of captivity to the time of exile, they do picture the prodigal coming home and the Father opening his arms wide. And then if we move to the book of Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah, remember Nehemiah is the 3rd person who leads some of the people back from the place of captivity and brings them back to the nation of Judah. The title meaning, the book derives its present title from the main character Nehemiah, originally part of Ezra in the Hebrew text, as we mentioned. The 2 were separated in Latin. It's in the historical section again. It's mostly narrative. Author and date, many scholars believe that Nehemiah and Ezra were compiled by the same person because of the internal similarities. Nehemiah 1:1 describes the contents of the book as the words of Nehemiah. Either Nehemiah wrote the second half of the book, which was originally Ezra and Nehemiah combined, or Ezra compiled the books quoting directly from Nehemiah. The book of Nehemiah focuses on events surrounding the 3rd return from exile in around 444 BC. Nehemiah served twice as governor of Judah. His time as governor spanned 12 years. You can continue to read there some of the dating and the specific issues. You open up in the book in chapter 1, and Nehemiah hears about the condition of Jerusalem broken down, the walls being broken down. Zerubbabel is able to lead them in rebuilding the temple. Ezra is beginning to return the heart of the people to God. And then Nehemiah is concerned because there's going to be no safety. And in those days, I like to say it this way, when the walls were down in an ancient city, it'd be like a major city today losing all of its electricity. The walls were not what powered and put on the lights, but it's what gave you security. And today we know in a major city, if there's a blackout, there can be a lot of crime, a lot of confusion. And that's what the walls being down would be like. The style of writing, as I mentioned, is narrative. Means it's not poetry, not prophecy, not didactic in a teaching form. And then the theme and key verse. The basic theme is that of renewed commitment to God, much like with Ezra, and you can read some of that commitment even as they're constructing the walls. The key verse is Nehemiah 2:18. It says, I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. Nehemiah is burdened by the walls being down in Jerusalem. He knows Zerubbabel and Ezra have led some people back, that there is a return of the people's hearts toward the Lord, but he knows the walls being down is going to leave them very vulnerable. And so he asks Artaxerxes, the Persian king, if he can go and he can help rebuild the walls. And Artaxerxes gives him letters of permission to go, kind of a permission slip, a hall pass, that when he's passing through other areas that anyone in the kingdom would allow Nehemiah to continue his work, and even provided the wood and had it shipped to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And when Nehemiah meets with the people at night, those are the words he gives as he shares with them. And then the at-a-glance chart, you look at Nehemiah, and it's 13 chapters. Chapters 1 through 7 deal with the preparation to reconstruct the wall, the reconstruction of the wall. Then they make a renewed covenant to the Lord in chapter 8. Chapter 11, obedience to the covenant. They begin to obey after they make their commitment. The first 7 chapters really are political. There's a lot of political stuff between the Persians and Nehemiah, who's the cupbearer to the king. He was a chief advisor to the king of the Persians. It shows you how influential God's people can be even in the secular world. And then the last chapters there, chapters 8 through 13, are spiritual. First part is focused on the construction of the walls. The second part is instruction of the people. And then the location is Jerusalem. And the time frame of this book is about 19 years. Problems, there are none except for minor disputes over dating again. Main characters, Nehemiah, Artaxerxes, the first of Persia, the people of Jerusalem. The main events are Nehemiah, who leaves Persia, the construction of the walls, the renewal of the covenant. I love, one of my favorite parts of Nehemiah is where they have to pause the construction because Sanballat and Tobiah and other enemies of what they're doing are causing them trouble. And the people are willing to put a sword on their side and lay brick, and some have their backs to the wall and they're just protecting as the walls are being rebuilt. And the people don't complain because of the the pressure they're under and the odd circumstances. And I always think, man, we as Christians, if we're inconvenienced in any way, we complain today, and yet they were willing to take the section of wall that their family had been assigned and work. And even when there was an enemy that came, they were willing to build with a sword on their side, or some of them stopped building and just protected, and they were willing to put up with difficult circumstances to accomplish what God had for them. And that's been a big lesson to me as a leader, to watch Nehemiah. And there's some great leadership stuff from Nehemiah. Chuck Swindoll had a wonderful book on this book of the Bible called Hand Me Another Brick, and it speaks about how we serve, and I'd encourage you to check out that book. God uses the theological significance. God uses sensitive, godly people to lead his people into renewal. And then really the personal significance is the same as the theological. God uses people who are willing to pray, to be open to what he has, like Nehemiah was, willing to step up and respond to God, and even have a reputation in the secular world where he was able to accomplish what God had for him because of his faithfulness, even beyond his relationship with God and the nation of Israel. That's Nehemiah. So Ezra, Nehemiah, we talked about Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah in those two books. And now we come to the story of a queen named Esther. She's a Jewish woman. She is married to Artaxerxes, the emperor of Persia. And so this is kind of like the book of Ruth was to the time of Judges. It's one story out of that time. And this is one story out of the time of Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. This book is named after the main character, Esther, and it's a historical book. It is the authorship and date. There's some details in there. I'll let you look at that. The events of Esther took place, the second paragraph there, under author and date, about 483 to 473 BC. It fit between chapters 6 and 7 of Ezra, so it sits right there in Ezra, between the first return led by Zerubbabel and the second led by, and it says Israel. That's a typo. That should say Ezra, not Israel. I'll make that correction in future notes. The author speaks of King Ahasuerus in the past tense, verse 1:1, causing some to believe that the book was written during the reign of Artaxerxes I. The style of writing, again, is narrative. It's telling a story as opposed to poetry or prophecy or didactic teaching. The theme, even though the name of God does not appear in the book, that's one of probably the thing Esther is known for the most, outside of this beautiful main character who steps up for God in a foreign land and with threat to her own life, is that God's name in no form in any way is mentioned in this book. It's the only book of the Bible that's true. And so for some time, critics of the scriptures questioned whether Esther should even be included in the Old Testament. But it's an incredible book in that it's God's people, the Jewish people, who have an influence in a foreign land, and you can see the hand of God all the way through it. It's almost as if his name doesn't have to be mentioned, because it obviously has his fingerprints everywhere. Even though the name of God does not appear in the book, the main theme of the book is God's providential protection of his people. Haman's plot to destroy the Jews is stopped by the courage of Esther and the counsel of her cousin Mordecai. The Jewish feast of Purim becomes an annual reminder of this event of great deliverance by God. And Purim has become one of those great celebrations. I know we were in Israel earlier in this year, and Purim was the next major holiday. And even in the malls, they were selling jewelry and clothing and other things based on Purim and Purim holiday sales. And that's when they think of how God used the wonderful Queen Esther. The key verse is Esther 8:6. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? She said, I have to step up. I have to speak up for my people. When there was someone Haman, who was manipulating the King Artaxerxes of the Persians to get all the Jews killed. Haman was kind of like an Adolf Hitler of his day. He was very anti-Semite. He wanted to eliminate them. And one of the queen, one of the wives perhaps of the harem of Artaxerxes or Ahasuerus, depending which king it is, she is a Jewish person herself. And so her cousin, sometimes referred to as uncle, we understand more of a cousin as we would call it today, he rats out Haman in the story, who's trying to get the Jews killed, and Esther has to step up to stop and to kind of expose the conspiracy of Haman to destroy people, God's people in that land. And God protects his people, and Haman is the one who is destroyed. And Esther steps out as a tool God uses to deliver her people from annihilation in the Persian capital, which perhaps could have included others like Nehemiah if she had not stood up. So you have the book at a glance. You have the selection of Esther as queen, the formulation of the plot by Haman to kill the Jews, triumph of Mordecai over Haman by getting her involved. You've got the feast of Ahasuerus. You've got the feast of Esther and Purim in the second half of the book. This takes place in Persia. Of course, Persia took over from the Babylonians. And so the Jews who had been taken from Jerusalem had been in under the Babylonians. And when the Persians take over, they're still in captivity. They're still in exile until they're led by Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah to the back to what is the promised land of that Moses returned to. 10 years is the period of time that's covered. The problems, as I mentioned, the name of God is not in this book. Main characters are Esther, Ahasuerus, or perhaps Artaxerxes I, depending on timing, Mordecai, Haman, and then the main events. Esther becomes queen. Mordecai reveals the plot to kill the king. We've got an extra preposition there. The plot by Haman to kill the Jews. Then Esther reveals the plot. Mordecai is honored. Haman is hanged for his treachery and really his treason to the king. The significance here is God's sovereignty and providence. God takes care of his people, and he used and put Esther in the right place. Matter of fact, one of the key thoughts in this book is a little phrase that she was raised up for such a time as this. Mordecai says, you are in this position of influence, Esther, as the queen to the emperor of the empire. You are in this position for such a time of this. This is your opportunity. And God uses Esther in those moments. These are some beautiful books. Sometimes we skip through those. We don't understand how they connect. But I hope that God just has blessed you with a fresh look at Ezra and Nehemiah and the wonderful queen, the faithful queen, who God used to deliver her people, Esther. God bless you. Looking forward to session number 6. And we'll go into the books of Job and Psalms.